Hello and welcome to Profiles and Issues, a Westchester cable television talk show that gives you in-depth interviews with prominent people in the news. I'm your host, Dennis Root. Due to the coronavirus, we are taping this program on Zoom for broadcast on our Optimum and Fios local cable channels before the June 23rd primary. Go to our website at thedennisrudenshow.com for additional viewing information. And don't forget to vote in the primary by absentee ballot or in person. Our topic for this broadcast, the 2020 Democratic Congressional Primary Race in the 17th Congressional District. This seat will be vacated by Nita Lowey at the end of this year. My special guest for this broadcast is Democratic congressional candidate Mondaire Jones. Mondaire, nice to see you again.
It's such a pleasure to be here again, and thanks for your viewers for watching this.
Okay, so since we last spoke, I see you racked up some additional endorsements. What you had, Catherine Parker, and there was, what's her name?
Since the last time, Legislator Parker, for whom I have tremendous respect, she's been a progressive champion in the Westchester County Legislature, but also not to be overlooked are three other county legislators in Westchester who endorsed me the same day. Vice Chair of the Westchester County Board of Legislators, Alfreda Williams, also Damon Mayer, and also Lyndon Williams. So 4 Westchester County legislators have endorsed my campaign. Of course, the Westchester...
You have some congressional people also, right? From other...
That's right. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has endorsed my campaign. AOC endorsed me on Friday, known as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
That's a biggie, yeah.
Secretary Julian Castro, another former presidential candidate on the Democratic side, and yesterday, Bernie Sanders.
Okay, so let's get into it. Many people would say that these last 3 months have been one of the most difficult and challenging periods in the history of our country, state, and county, with both the coronavirus and recently the tragic and brutal murder, as witnessed on video, of George Floyd, an African American, by a police officer in Minnesota. Please share with us your thoughts on this event.
You're absolutely right about that. With respect to COVID-19, which at this point has been compared to the 1918 Spanish flu, and we know that over 100,000 people have died, unfortunately, from COVID-19. It is something that is largely unprecedented in our history. And then most recently, approximately a week and a half ago, the brutal murder of George Floyd. But you know, there were other stories from that same week. Chris Cooper was threatened by a woman in Central Park. His race was weaponized against him. That was a scandal for a few days before the brutal murder of George Floyd. We also saw protests that same week over the killing of Breonna Taylor, which in actuality had happened months prior, but intensified over that. And she was unarmed as well. And so it's been a really difficult past few weeks to be.
Well, there was also an incident in upstate Buffalo, New York. I believe a 73-year-old or 75-year-old demonstrator was thrown to the ground by the police, and no one came. I saw the video. No one came to even pick him up. They just ran over.
The treatment of protesters and people who are at rallies has really contributed to the feeling that we need desperately reforms in policing in this country among the public.
So I have to ask the question. I'm sure of your answer, but I have to ask it anyway. Do you think our current police system promotes systemic racism and violence?
You know, there is systemic racism in all aspects of our society, and law enforcement agencies are not immune from that, which is why it's so frustrating that certain police unions would suggest otherwise. You know, there's nothing that says that as soon as you put on a badge, there's no way you could possibly be racist or be prejudiced. And so we desperately need reforms. I'm running for United States Congress, and so I have a number of ideas about how we can go about doing that. One of those things is enacting national standards. And I know that there are some constitutional concerns over that. At a minimum, we can use financial incentives and disincentives to make sure that local agencies who are receiving federal funds adopt those standards. Police officers should be
keep going.
Police officers should be required to identify themselves. They should be required to engage in de-escalation tactics, which they should be perfectly capable of doing, because otherwise, what would separate them in terms of expertise from anyone else on the street? The chokehold should be banned as a procedure, and it is also the case that when we are investigating and prosecuting instances of the killing of unarmed civilians by police officers, that should be undertaken by independent investigatory authorities, not the district attorney's office, which is working every single day with law enforcement officers. There's an inherent conflict of interest there.
So would you agree, even though it's on the state level now, would you agree with Governor Cuomo? He wants to introduce legislation that would empower the New York State Attorney General's office to investigate charges of police corruption and brutality?
Absolutely. I'm very supportive of those reforms. It's unfortunate that it took nationwide protests to get a number of these things enacted and voted on. A number of my colleagues are in the state legislature, but they only co-sponsored repealing 50A, which shields the disciplinary records of police officers from public view and consideration. After the killing of George Floyd and national protests ensued. That was legislation that was introduced in January 2019. So we need more political courage in this state and throughout this country.
I want to say to our viewers and to you, although we're talking about how the police have to be, some of the faults in the system, from my own personal experiences and many others, there are many good people in the system, but the question is, how do you root out the rotten apples?
Absolutely.
That's something that do you favor the transparency of disciplinary records of police officers? Because from what I understand, if they mess up, those records don't follow them, and they just run from one place to another.
And that is precisely the 50A legislation that I was referring to. That on the books right now is a law that says that you can't see, absent a court order, the disciplinary records of police officers. We know from the number of instances that have been occurring over the past few years that many of these police officers who have engaged in this horrible conduct have a record of doing so. And so there's just been no accountability. And of course, we know that when there is transparency, there can be accountability.
Right. Anything else on the federal level with regard to this that you have in mind as of now to introduce?
No, there is a judge-made doctrine called qualified immunity. And it's nothing that exists as a law in the books. It's something that judges created. The Supreme Court created it, wrongfully so. And what it does is it allows officers to avoid legal liability, civil liability under the law, even when it is clear that they have violated the constitutional rights of civilians. And so we have to repeal qualified immunity. We have to pass we have to eliminate that. We can do that statutorily at the federal level. And that is something that I would be very supportive of. And I know that that's been proposed already in the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats.
All right. Now, I'd like to clarify, if you can help us, this term defunded, because I've heard different definitions of what that means. The average person on the street hears that, and they say, oh, well, that means you take away all the money from the police department. Is that so?
Yeah, I've been having this conversation often this week. Um, I'll tell you what it means to me, because it does mean different things to different people.
Right.
It means reduce the funding for law enforcement agencies and redirect some of that money towards social workers, quality public schools, and other institutions of civil society that would do a great good in improving public safety without requiring you to police largely Black and Hispanic communities.
Um, with the is it true that, and I'm not sure whether it's the federal government that allocates the money or the local government. Is it true that they spend millions of dollars, local state, if the states or the municipal on things like paramilitary tanks and armor and everything? Do you think that the police should have that? Is that the role of police, to be a military state?
No, I think Americans across the political spectrum have been horrified by the images that they have seen of tanks, grenades, tear gas, all types of military grade equipment being deployed by local law enforcement officials against civilians who overwhelmingly, by the way, are protesting peacefully. And that is a function of federal policy over the past few decades. I would say it started with the 1994 crime bill, which incentivized law enforcement agencies to adopt any number of draconian practices and gave them federal funding to purchase this kind of equipment. Of course, there is legislation today that has been proposed by Congressman Hank Johnson, which would prevent the practice that currently exists, which is that the federal government sends excess military-grade equipment to local law enforcement agencies. We have to end that process. My goodness. We don't need our local law enforcement agencies using weapons of war against members of the civilian population who, again, overwhelmingly are peacefully protesting.
All right. Now, I want to go to the other side of the spectrum. I watched the demonstrations like many Americans. I spoke to many people. That's why I like doing the talk show, because as a former teacher, I like to, not to, to educate, have people think about things. I thought, that most of the demonstrators were peaceful. But what did upset me was that radical elements were able to penetrate the certain segments of the demonstration and not even and cause havoc and amongst the demonstrators, antagonize the police, and did a lot of in Manhattan, but still it's New York. What do you call it? Cause a lot of damage, and they seemed to be highly organized, using cell phones, tapping in with computers to bikes so that they could break into Macy's. Obviously, that was not the regular demonstrators, but I, as a younger man, I believe in that right of demonstration. I participated, but I have never seen things like this, and it's scary. So how do you create some kind of balance where you let people demonstrate, but it's not an easy question I'm giving you. I'm sorry.
And I would start by making the observation that many of these people engaging in vandalism were white nationalists who were sent to sort of disrupt otherwise peaceful.
Yeah.
If you
Well,
listen,
I'm not saying they were part of the core. They weren't there for a cause. They were there for disruption because they were so organized. You could see that. But, a lot of them that actually went into the stores looked young. And what I'm wondering is, as a former teacher, I say this, do you just let these people walk on bail? or maybe they have to serve in some kind of public service program and clean up the streets and work hard so that they see all the damage that they've done and they develop some kind of ethics. Does that sound too Pollyanna or not?
I think that police officers do an important function when they prevent the vandalism of private property or public property for that matter. And there's just a way to do it that doesn't require undue.
But these young people or whoever was organizing, what they like with Macy's, Macy's was not the original site where they were demonstrating, and they got on their phones and they targeted areas and they hit those areas before the cops got there to stop them. You understand what I'm saying? This is what I saw with my own eyes on the video.
You can look, and that's unacceptable. And I think that law enforcement officers can if there were no protests and somebody were doing that, the obligation of law enforcement to protect private property and public property for that matter would be the same. What people have been taking issue with is just the tactics that have been deployed by the law enforcement officers, excessive force, oftentimes.
No, I understand that. All I'm trying to say is I am concerned that people still have the right to demonstrate. But when you have these other groups that infiltrate, it clouds their message. And not everybody can differentiate. Because what are the news media? I don't care if it's Fox, I don't care if it's MSNBC. Yes, different political views, they may show more pictures of one kind than another. But still, that camera is ultimately going to switch to the damage that's being done. And that's going to cloud the message.
It's unfortunate. What I've been encouraging people to do is to reserve their outrage primarily for the killing of Black and Hispanic people in this country unjustifiably by law enforcement. Property is something that is as awful as it is that people would vandalize property, and I don't condone it at all. I've been encouraging peaceful protests and rallies, and indeed have myself been speaking at a number of rallies all throughout Westchester and Rockland counties in support of the dismantling of systemic racism. But when I see people getting more upset, I'm not saying this is you, because it's not you. When I see people getting more upset about the vandalization of private property than they are about the killings that spawn those protests and those rallies, I think we really miss the mark, and we miss an opportunity to use the channel.
I know, but why they get upset is because they see people's businesses and futures destroyed. And like you said, white nationalists, it wasn't just white businesses they went into. They went into African American, and they hit everything that they could. All right, let's move on because there are other things. Yesterday, Tuesday, Westchester County entered phase 2 of the Back to Work program. 24,000 New Yorkers died from the virus in Westchester County and 2,600 in the Hudson Valley. Are you satisfied? 24,000 New Yorkers died and 2,600 in the Hudson Valley. Are you satisfied the way the government handled it? And basically what I want to go into is this. As a result of the coronavirus and the death of George Floyd, this has wiped our economy, as well as people becoming ill and dying. Have any of your priorities changed as to what you would like to accomplish in Congress in your first term if elected?
Yeah, we have to do immediate cash assistance for people who have been harmed by the economic devastation that you mentioned earlier. Unemployment is sky high. People are comparing it to approaching Great Depression rates. And this is all happening within a healthcare system where your health insurance is largely provided through your employer. And so just to see that over the past 10 weeks, 40 million people have simply lost their jobs. is horrifying, and it's why I support Medicare for all, as you know. I am not pleased with how the government has responded to COVID-19. We could be doing so much more as a federal government. Obviously, the guy who's the president of the United States right now could have been taking this more seriously from the beginning, and could have used his authorities, including the Defense Production Act, to make sure that we had the PPE that we needed very early on.
Yeah, President Trump, yeah.
Including our essential workers. I hope that we are able to reopen our society, but people are still going to need to be wearing masks and, as appropriate, wearing gloves. What I worry about is a resurgence of COVID-19, because people think that we are no longer having to deal with this, and we've seen that already take place in other parts of this country that were taking COVID-19 far less seriously than people in New York, which obviously is ground zero for it. So I do worry that we're not fully prepared to reopen.
I don't mean to sound like a pessimist, but example, they say that when you go to haircut places, beauty parlor for women, etc., you're going to have a mask on, especially with women, and or men. They're going to do hair coloring, and or they allow outdoor dining. Well, if you're going to eat, then you got to take off your mask. I mean, again, I'm not trying to be. I know it's a very difficult problem, but it just doesn't totally make sense to me how that is going to be implemented. To me, the only real solution is to get an antidote, a vaccine, and the government and the federal government should be using its priority to promote that. And instead, I think you find that the states have to do it. Governor Cuomo himself had to make deals with the laboratories, right, to do research.
I like you am very concerned. I was in my neighborhood earlier today, and I saw people not wearing masks at restaurants and that kind of thing, and I wondered about that. So we have to make sure that we're all being vigilant, that we're all taking the necessary precautions, and until we get further guidance from health professionals and scientists. I'm going to be looking to see what the state health commissioner says before I listen to what any elected official has to say about the matter of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In our remaining moments, which is easy for you, look into that camera and talk to the voters and tell them why you think Mondaire Jones should go to Congress.
Yeah. This race has gotten really crowded since Congresswoman Lowy announced her retirement on Thursday, October 10th. But one thing has remained constant, and that is I am running for Congress, not because someone always told me I'd be a member of Congress when I was growing up, or because I have a lot of money to throw at this race, because frankly, I don't come from money. I'm running for Congress because for me, policy is personal. It's the reason why in the midst of the racial unrest that we are seeing, the protests over injustice in our society, that it didn't take that for me to talk about racial justice. In fact, I was talking about it from the very beginning of this campaign as one of several things that we needed to address desperately as a society. I grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps, and my young single mom still had to work multiple jobs just to put food on the table for us, and she got help raise me from my grandparents. My grandfather was a janitor, my grandmother cleaned homes, and when daycare was too expensive, she took me to work with her. And now I get to run to represent the same people whose homes I watched my grandmother clean growing up. For me, so many of the inequities that we are seeing in our policy are things that I know to exist from firsthand experience, and I carry that with me wherever I go. It is what will make sure that I am always fighting in the best interests of the constituents. Even when the doors are closed in the halls of Congress and those constituents can't see what I'm doing, I can be trusted to always fight for them tooth and nail, because for me, policy is personal. I'm grateful to have the professional experience to prepare me for this job. I went to Stanford University and Harvard Law School. I worked in the Obama administration for an attorney general who actually cared about social justice, vetting candidates for federal judgeships, and working on criminal justice reform. I worked in the city for a number of years as a lawyer, but also found time to invest hundreds of hours in investigating claims of employment discrimination, and helping families who were defrauded during the financial crisis get some of that money back. I'm a nonprofit founder. I co-founded an organization that teaches professional skills to underserved middle school students in 3 American cities. And more recently, I have been litigating and winning some of Westchester County's biggest cases on behalf of taxpayers and drafting some legislation. So I have all of the requisite experience. But one thing that distinguishes me from the other people in this race is my lived experiences. And I think if there's ever been a moment in American history when we need people in office who have the lived experiences to address some of the biggest problems that we have, it is right now. And I think people are seeing that all across the district in both Westchester and Rockland County. So please join me in this fight and help elect me on June 23rd. And I promise that I will always fight alongside you.
Okay. Mondaire Jones, it's always an honor and pleasure to have you on the program. We want you to stay in touch with us because we know that wherever fate takes you, you'll always be fighting worthwhile causes, etc. And we're thankful for your leadership. And best of luck in your race for Congress. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Right. Okay. And that's it for this program on profiles and issues. This is Dennis Rubin saying so long until the next time.